Okay, let's unpack this. You've handed us a really fascinating, and yes, let's acknowledge right up front, a deeply controversial book.
Hmm.
The central idea it presents is that the history we've been taught isn't the full story, suggesting there have been hidden forces, secret societies actively shaping major world events behind the scenes.
What's fascinating here is the specific, complex, and intricate narrative this source weaves
Yeah.
together to support that idea.
Right.
It traces a remarkably detailed line through history, connecting figures and movements that are often discussed in isolations, or maybe not discussed at all, linking them in a way you might not typically encounter in standard historical accounts.
Exactly. So welcome to this deep dive. We're stepping into one very particular, very complex, and frankly, provocative historical narrative.
Yeah.
Our source material for this entire exploration, our guide through this specific terrain, is Robert Sepper's book, 1666 Redemption Through Sin, Global Conspiracy and History.
And the mission here is absolutely crucial. We are focused entirely, and I mean entirely, on extracting and understanding the information,
Yeah.
the core arguments, and the presented connections within this book.
That's key.
Our goal is to trace the author's path through historical figures, religious movements, secret societies, world events, all through the specific lens this book provides, pulling out the key details and enlist links it highlights.
Absolutely. Our role is to be your impartial guides through this specific text. It's about understanding this narrative, the claims it makes, and the alleged evidence it uses to support them. This is especially important when the book touches on sensitive, politically charged, or historically contentious topics.
Right.
We are simply reporting on the content presented in the source text itself, making it clear that we are conveying the ideas from the book, not validating or refuting its claims, nor are we taking any sides on the topics it discusses.
Think of us as your partners in navigating this particular body of work you've shared with us. We're here to help you identify the key nuggets of information, trace the intricate connections, and understand the framework. But always, always as presented within the pages of this specific book.
Right, so if we're going to follow the narrative laid out in this book, it suggests this story of hidden forces really kicks off with a figure who made an extraordinary claim back in 1666.
That's where the book begins its deep dive, with Sabbatai Zevi, born in 1626 and passing away in 1676.
Okay.
The source introduces him as a remarkably charismatic rabbi and Kabbalist who managed to gather an absolutely massive following in his time.
How massive are we talking?
The book states he accumulated over 1 million believers, which, according to the source, represented roughly half the entire world's Jewish population back in the 17th century.
Yeah.
That's an astonishing level of influence.
Wow. 1 million followers in the 1660s, that scale alone is incredible. And the book says he achieved this, or part of it, by proclaiming something truly revolutionary, something that fundamentally inverted conventional religious thought.
Yeah, this is the core.
The idea that redemption was available not by avoiding sin, but through acts of sin.
This was the core doctrine that set him apart, and the book emphasizes its incredibly radical and controversial implications.
I can imagine.
The source details various practices it claims the Sabbateans engaged in, stemming from this idea. It mentions abolishing traditional ritual observances, turning fasting days into occasions for feasting.
Okay, kind of turning things upside down.
Exactly. And, most controversially, it alleges the encouragement and practice of sexual promiscuity, adultery, incest, and collective religious orgies among his followers.
Wow. That is a complete inversion of religious law. The book links Zevi's rise and this radical doctrine in part to the wider dissemination of Lurianic Kabbalah, the mystical teachings of Rabbi Isaac Luria, made more accessible at the time thanks to the printing press.
Yes, the printing press played a role in spreading Luria's ideas more broadly. The source explains that a significant part of Lurianic Kabbalah's appeal was its emphasis on actively participating and bringing about the Messiah's arrival, and on repairing the world, or tikkun olam.
And central to this concept, as the book presents it based on Lurianic thought, was the idea of holy sparks. Can you walk us through that concept purely as the source describes it?
Certainly. According to the Lurianic interpretation discussed in the book, the process of creation involved God contracting or forming vessels to contain his infinite divine light.
Okay.
However, the light was apparently too intense, and these vessels shattered, scattering sparks of this divine light throughout the material world.
Uh-huh.
These holy sparks became trapped within matter, essentially concealing God's presence in the physical universe. The task, within Lurianic Kabbalah, was to gather and free these trapped sparks, thereby helping to repair the world and hasten redemption.
How did they do that?
Well, how individuals interacted with the material world was believed to potentially release these sparks.
Okay, so the goal was freeing these trapped sparks. The book then introduces a Kabbalistic synthesis that allegedly influenced Zevi, blending pagan and Gnostic elements into this existing framework.
That's right. And it delves into a complex idea drawn from this synthesis, which is central to the Sabbatean heresy. The notion that evil isn't meant to be destroyed in a straightforward battle, but rather return to its divine source.
Return to its source.
The source uses metaphors from the Zohar and Luria to illustrate this, such as include the left within the right, or uplift the fallen Starks, that are embedded within the realm of evil or imperfection.
And this is where the radical redemption through sin interpretation allegedly emerges.
Precisely. The source highlights that what terms heretical Kabbalists, particularly the Sabbateans, took these concepts to an extreme conclusion. They believed that acts intended to benefit God included deliberate forays into the realm of sin and transgression. The idea, as presented in the book, was that by actively entering and engaging with the world of perceived sin and evil, one could expose its illusory nature and, crucially, elevate the holy sparks that were most deeply trapped within that impure realm.
Okay, so going into the darkness to find the light, so to speak.
Sort of, and this is presented as a stark contrast to the original Lurianic practice, which focused on inward prayer intentions, or kavanah, for achieving these rectifications.
So Zevi appears at this pivotal time. The book describes his personality in vivid terms, portraying him as remarkably charming and inviting.
It really does. It even includes a quote from Rabbi Leib ben Ozer describing his appearance and singing voice, which was so enchanting it was like listening to one of God's angels, making it impossible to look into his face directly when he sang.
That quote really paints a picture of his charisma and the effect he had on people.
Absolutely. Yeah. Beyond his personality, the source also points to phenomena surrounding him that were described by believers as clearly supernatural.
Like what?
This included accounts of prophets, men, women, and even children, who reportedly began speaking fluently in Hebrew and the language of the Zohar, even if they had no prior knowledge of these languages.
Wow. And rabbis having prophetic dreams about Zevi. The book contextualizes this by noting the widespread expectation at the time for the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, particularly the coming of the Messiah and the promise of a Jewish homeland, an expectation heightened after events like the Spanish Inquisition.
That historical backdrop is key to understanding the fervent hope his appearance ignited. And the source specifically mentions a numerological significance that was attributed to the year 1666 itself.
Ah, the number of the beast connection.
Well, the book notes that the declared day of his revelation was the 18th day, which is 6 plus 6 plus 6 of the 6th month in the year 1666.
Okay, got it.
This specific timing was interpreted by his followers as deeply significant and crucial for the Messiah's advent and the dawning of the Messianic age.
Now, the book is careful to present different perspectives on Zevi's often erratic behavior.
Right. It tries to show both sides.
While followers saw it as mystical or prophetic, critical interpretations, cited from various sources within the book, point to signs potentially indicative of manic depressive psychosis, describing periods of ecstatic behavior followed by deep seclusion, violating religious laws, and engaging in sexual immorality.
Yes, several sources are mentioned for those critical perspectives. However, the book also incorporates alternative interpretations, particularly from neo-Sabbateans and certain scholars.
What did they say?
They argue that his behavior wasn't necessarily psychosis, but rather behavior expected or understood within the context of certain intense religious mysticism, drawing parallels to Sufi practices like chanting, prayer trance states, and ecstatic dancing.
The source even mentions Professor Abraham Elkomam's view that Zevi frequently engaged in Bektashi Sufi rituals and highlights the detail. This is fascinating. That Zevi's grave in Albania became and remains to this day a Sufi shrine.
Yeah, that intersection is really interesting. This connection to Sufism, and particularly the Bektashi order, is something the source returns to, highlighting their reputation as antinomian, meaning lawless, from a more orthodox Sunni perspective.
Before reaching that point, though, the book notes that Zevi's increasingly unusual behavior led to his expulsion from Smyrna around 1650. He then traveled and eventually met Nathan of Gaza in Palestine in 1665.
Nathan of Gaza is presented as an absolutely pivotal figure in the Sabbatean narrative.
The source says he was the rabbi who not only confirmed Zevi's messianic status to him, but also became one of his most ardent proponents and the key interpreter of his radical actions and doctrines.
Basically, Zevi's chief theologian and propagandist, if you will.
Right. Zevi's formal public revelation as the Messiah then followed in 1666, and he rapidly gained fervent support throughout the Jewish diaspora, fueling hopes with promises of an imminent return to a Jewish homeland in the land of Israel.
Despite this widespread popular support, the book notes that the leading rabbis of Jerusalem firmly rejected his claims and actions.
That must have been a blow.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The source says they delivered an ultimatum, telling Zevi he must leave Jerusalem or face excommunication.
So he returned to Turkey, where the Ottoman Sultan initially showed some tolerance towards the movement.
Yeah, the book speculates this was likely influenced by the significant revenue generated from Jewish tourism as people from across the globe flocked to witness the supposed Messiah. Money talks.
Release does.
However, the book presents a rumored account where the Sultan's patience wore thin when Zevi purportedly proclaimed that the temple in Jerusalem would be rebuilt the following year. This allegedly caused offense to the Sultan.
And the most commonly accepted version of events, as presented in the book, is that the Sultan eventually presented Zevi with a stark ultimatum: convert to Islam, taking the turban, or face execution, having his head taken.
A tough choice. And Zevi chose conversion. The figure who had declared himself the Messiah publicly converted to Islam, adopting the name Aziz Mehmed Effendi.
Unbelievable.
The source notes he was even given a position as keeper of the gate and seemed to continue some level of messianic activity, apparently with the knowledge of the Islamic authorities.
This public conversion, understandably, caused immense dismay and confusion among his many followers. How did they rationalize that?
Well, Nathan of Gaza and other loyal followers rapidly developed a radical interpretation to explain this seemingly contradictory act.
Which was?
Yes, they framed it not as a betrayal or an act of cowardice, but as a necessary mystical descent. According to their interpretation, the Messiah had to deliberately descend into the kleptotic realm, often translated as the grossest reality or husks of creation, the domain of evil, in order to reclaim the last, most deeply embedded sparks of divine light trapped there. This descent was considered essential to ultimately repair the world.
So another going into the darkness justification.
Exactly. The source notes that modern scholars often conclude that these complex Kabbalistic concepts were employed by Zevi and his followers primarily to justify his otherwise heretical and radical behavior.
This radical interpretation found particular acceptance among the Danma, a group of religious converts in Anatolia who, despite outwardly embracing Islam, secretly maintained their Jewish identity and continuation of Sabbatean mystical practices.
Right, living a double life, essentially. The book also notes that this interpretation resonated with conversos and Marranos in Spain and Portugal, who had been forcibly converted to Christianity but secretly held on to their Jewish faith and Kabbalistic traditions. Similar pressures, similar solutions, maybe.
The source also includes the perspective of Rebbe Yaakov Leib HaKohen, identified as the director of Danma West, who offers a defense of Zevi's conversion.
What's his take?
HaKohen argues it was a mystical masim zarim, a strange action, that was specifically required of the Messiah for deeper spiritual reasons, rather than being motivated by fear or cowardice.
So a necessary, albeit bizarre, step in the divine plan.
HaKohen's view, as presented in the book, is that the ultimate collapse and mainstream rejection of the movement wasn't due to Zevi's actions themselves, but rather the inability of the broader Jewish populace to understand or accept the profound mystical necessity of these actions, blaming the audience, essentially.
Interesting perspective. Returning to the Sufism connection, the source explores this further, noting Zevi's purported high regard for Sufism and his alleged practice of Gnostic techniques drawn from various mystical traditions. It specifically claims he participated in the rites of the Bektashi Sufi order, describing both the Bektashi and Levi groups as being antinomian or lawless from a more orthodox Sunni perspective due to their practices.
And the book details the specific Bektashi Alevi practices it links to Sabbateanism. They reportedly did not strictly follow the 5 daily prayers of Islam, preferring more private devotion or communal gatherings called sem.
Right.
They did not adhere to the strict fasting requirements of Ramadan. They consumed alcohol and, according to the source, did not regard it as sinful. They emphasized equality with men and women together in their Kem and Zakrullah rituals, and their pilgrimage was often directed towards Sufi shrines and revered elders rather than the traditional Hajj to Mecca.
A very different flavor of Islam. The modern Donmi interpretation of this spiritual conversion, as discussed in the source, frames it as a way to achieve sacred reconciliation between two religions.
How so?
By internalizing the seemingly alien religion outwardly, they believe they reconcile the outward antagonism between the faiths, and, in doing so, help to raise the holy sparks trapped within each system, leading to a higher spiritual unity. Kind of a bridge building through blending.
The advent and actions of Zevi also had a profound impact on how Lurianic Kabbalah itself was viewed and practiced by his followers.
Oh, absolutely. The source includes striking quotes from Nathan of Gaza, who stated that the traditional prayer intentions, kavanah, and rectifications, tikkunim, taught by Luria, were no longer appropriate or valid after Zevi's appearance.
Really? Obsolete.
He declared that times have changed, comparing it to inappropriately using intentions meant for a weekday during the sacred time of the Sabbath, a total paradigm shift.
Nathan's view, as presented in the source, was that the entire system of religious law, halakha, that existed prior to Zevi's advent was now obsolete. He even claimed that Luria's own mystical writings should not be read by anyone except Luria's most trusted disciple, Chaim Vital.
That demonstrates the radical break Sabbateanism represented. It wasn't just a new interpretation, it was a replacement almost.
And this brings us back to the central and most controversial tenet, the justification of sin.
Right, the core heresy.
The source details this further, explaining the Sabbatean doctrine was fundamentally about liberating those holy sparks believed to be hidden within apparent evil and transgression.
Yes, and Zevi's own highly symbolic actions, like deliberately eating forbidden fats or transforming Jewish fast days into joyous feast days, were interpreted as direct applications of this doctrine.
Like living proof of the new era.
Exactly. The source includes a prayer attributed to Zevi himself. Blessed art thou who makes the forbidden things permissible.
That's bold.
To say the least. The underlying concept, as the book explains the Sabbatean belief, was that the ultimate redemption was incomplete. It couldn't be fully realized until the very last sparks, nitzotzot, trapped within the impure realm, kelopot, were somehow gathered by the Redeemer.
And how did they think that worked?
And crucially, the book emphasizes the Messiah, meaning Zevi himself, was believed to be constrained or required to commit these strange acts, masim zarim, including the ultimate transgression of apostasy by converting to Islam, for the successful fulfillment of his mission and the final stages of this cosmic rectification.
So the sinning was mandatory for the Messiah.
According to this interpretation, yes, it was part of the job description.
This doctrine led to a radical shift in psychology and the importance of concealment. The source presents a key Sabbatean principle. Whoever is as he appears cannot be a true believer.
The idea of hiding your true self.
This created a perceived duty among followers to deliberately conceal their true faith and deny it outwardly. The source uses the metaphor of a seed needing to be covered in the earth to grow. The outward covering or denial was seen as essential for the hidden truth to germinate.
Makes sense in a way.
It includes a striking quote from the Sabbatean theologian Cardozo's formulation. The King Messiah had to don the garments of a Marrano and appear outwardly unrecognized, and this obliged every single Jew to metaphorically become a Marrano, hiding their true inner state.
So, according to this doctrine, true spiritual acts were hidden and internal, negating the perceived falsehood of outward appearances and explicit religious law.
Exactly. The source describes this as a revolution of values, where the sacred could paradoxically become expressed through the profane, and vice versa.
This resulted in a legacy of secret practices among Zevi's followers. Zevi himself remains the most famous historical example of a Jewish convert to Islam, and the term Sabbatean often denotes this specific historical group and its descendants, particularly the Donma.
And his inner circle followed him.
The book notes that Zevi's inner circle, his wife, and his relatives allegedly followed him in converting to Islam, although Nathan of Gaza reportedly remained Jewish, but was excommunicated by mainstream authorities. He walked a fine line.
The source details fascinating and controversial similarities it draws between the practices of the Donma and the Bektashi Sufis.
Right, more on that connection.
Including violation of Jewish dietary laws, kashrut, and Islamic purity laws, halal, ritualistic group sex and wife swapping, ecstatic mystical practices, a focus on mystical Kabbalah, and an occult reading of the Torah and Quran.
These sects reportedly continued and even flourished in secret after Zevi's death, maintaining these practices. The book describes the Festival of the Lamb, purportedly observed annually on the 22nd of Adar, particularly in Salonika and Izmir.
What did that involve?
It's described as a secret rite involving dinner, drug use, a symbolic sacrifice leading to nudity, and the extinguishing of the lights, culminating in darkness and the sexual sharing of daughters and wives.
Wow. The source connects this particular rite to ancient pagan practices, specifically mentioning the cult of the Great Mother and the light extinguishers in Asia Minor, suggesting a continuity of certain transgressive religious behaviors.
And it explains the underlying metaphor, again linked to Kabbalistic concepts, the idea of the grain of wheat rotting in the earth before it can sprout.
Okay.
In this context, the violation of Torah law paradoxically becomes its fulfillment in the Messianic age. Deeds had to become truly rotten in appearance to germinate redemption.
So more justification for breaking rules.
This conveyed the sectarian psychology. One must deny the explicit, outward Torah during the concealed period of redemption for it to become transformed, concealed itself, and ultimately renewed on a higher hidden level.
The source then discusses the broader Sabbatean influence. It mentions the view that many Sabbateans later became followers of Hasidism, a mystical Jewish movement that did adhere to halakha, traditional Jewish law.
That's an interesting claim, given the differences.
Although there were disputes among rabbis accusing each other of being secret Sabbateans. Lots of finger-pointing, it seems.
It includes the widely cited quote from the eminent scholar Gershom Scholem, who saw Sabbatianism as the matrix of every significant movement in Jewish life in the last 300 years. From Hasidism to Reform Judaism to the earliest Masonic circles and revolutionary idealism.
That's a huge claim, positioning Sabbatianism as a transformative, if often hidden, force.
The book describes Sabbatean believers as feeling they were champions of a new world, one that would be established by the radical overthrow of the values of traditional positive religions.
Revolutionaries, in a sense.
The radical insistence on the potential holiness of sin, even while attempting to justify it with selective and out-of-context readings from texts like the Talmud, the book, mentions a dictum about transgression for its own sake being greater than a commandment not for its own sake.
Right.
Caused significant internal conflicts within the Jewish community and deeply alienated average observant Jews. You can see why.
Absolutely. And this is where the book introduces the figure who allegedly became Sabbatai Zevi's successor and took these nihilistic tendencies and radical practices to an even new peak, incorporating religious sex orgies on solstices and equinoxes. Jacob Frank.
Okay, let's transition then and delve into the section on Jacob Frank and Frankism, as presented in this source. The book introduces Jacob Frank, born in 1726, as Sabbatai Zevi's true successor.
According to one source, at least.
According to one source cited, yes, Jerry Roubaud's book. He was reportedly born as the son of a Polish Sabbatean, deeply steeped in that tradition from birth.
And he allegedly extended Zevi's already radical teachings even further. According to the book, drawing from Roubaud, Frank taught that the advent of the Messianic age fundamentally transformed sexual prohibitions into not just permissions, but positive obligations.
Yes, and the source quotes Roubaud directly here, stating that for Frank, engaging in sexual orgies became the primary means to purify the soul from its sins.
Purification through orgies.
The infamous line from Roubaud's book is quoted, "Debauchery became therapy." This highlights the complete inversion of moral values Frank allegedly promoted.
Frank himself claimed to be a reincarnation of both Sabbatai Zevi and the biblical patriarch Jacob. The book positions Frankism as directly instigated by Lurianic Kabbalah and a radical expansion of Zevi's redemption through sin philosophy.
Frank's theology, as described in the source, was even more extreme than Zevi's in some ways. He asserted that the creator God of the universe was distinct from, and importantly, different from the God of the Israelites presented in the Bible, believing the biblical God was inherently evil. The source notes a clear Gnostic influence in this particular belief, like the demiurge idea.
Right, and flowing from that, he allegedly rejected every moral law and commandment found in existing religious texts. The source presents Frank's belief that the only possible way to usher in a new, desired society was through the total, absolute destruction of the present civilization and its moral framework.
Total annihilation as a prerequisite for rebirth.
This led to some of the most shocking practices detailed in the book. It claims that for Frank and his followers, acts such as child sacrifice, rape, incest, and even drinking blood were not only acceptable, but considered necessary rituals on the path to purification and redemption.
Good heavens.
Viewed as ways to fully embrace the evil of the present world in order to destroy it.
Unsurprisingly, given these doctrines and practices, Jewish authorities in Poland excommunicated Frank and his followers. The book notes his specific heretical doctrines included the deification of himself and the promotion of purification through transgression.
The source reiterates the description of their annual springtime lamb festivals.
Ah, yes, a festival again.
Which allegedly involved communal dinners, drug use, symbolic sacrifice, nudity, and the exchanging of spouses and daughters for religious sex rituals. Frank's rejection of traditional Torah interpretation was total.
And, mirroring Zevi's actions, he notably converted to both Islam and Catholicism during his lifetime, seeing these conversions as part of his Messianic mission to infiltrate and subvert all religions.
Following the playbook, his personal behavior, as detailed in the book and cited by sources, was equally transgressive, often reportedly sleeping with his female followers and even his own daughter, Eve Frank.
Yikes.
His core doctrine, according to the source, was that the absolute best way to imitate the true hidden God was to deliberately cross every boundary, transgress every conceivable taboo, and mix the sacred and the profane in every aspect of life, just as he claimed the true God had done in creating a seemingly evil world.
While his approximately 50,000 followers were fewer than Zevi's, the book notes that his network was highly influential, reportedly including individuals from European royalty, nobility, and some of the richest bankers of the era.
Ah, the connection to power.
Suggesting a strategic focus on power centers. Quality over quantity, perhaps?
The central theological point underpinning Frankism, as presented, was this pseudo-Gnostic perspective of garbing the holy in the unholy.
Right.
It involved deliberately entering the realm of the profane, the world of perceived evil, in order to imitate the true God who, according to their belief, had created a wholly evil world through an initial act of transgression or dissent.
Eve Frank, his daughter, became a central figure in the sect, known as the Lady, or Holy Matron Mother. She reportedly played a key role in the sex rituals and, according to the source, continued leading the sect after Frank's death.
A family business in a very strange way.
The book includes a quote attributed to Jacob Frank, asserting that the need for traditional commandments or prayers had ended in the Messianic age. The only path remaining was listening to the leader and going to a certain hidden place, implying a secret internal path outside a conventional religion.
The esteemed scholar Gershom Scholem is famously quoted in the book offering a chilling assessment of Frank, calling him one of the most frightening phenomena in the history of Judaism and a truly corrupt and degenerate individual. Strong words.
Very strong. And the book includes Frank's own purported candid summation of his path. It is one thing to worship God and quite another to follow the path that I have taken, acknowledging the radical and unconventional nature of his movement.
Frank's core teaching, as presented in the source, was a philosophy of radical freedom and negation. It was about freeing oneself from all external laws, social conventions, and existing religions.
Total liberation or nihilism, depending on your view.
Adopting and rejecting every attitude and belief and following the leader, Frank himself, into what he termed the abyss.
The annihilation of every existing religion and positive belief system was presented as the true path to liberation and spiritual advancement. He taught that to ascend to a higher state, one must first make a deliberate descent.
Descent idea again.
The source quotes him directly on this. No man can climb a mountain until he has first descended to its foot. He reportedly used the metaphor of Jacob's ladder being shaped like a V, suggesting one must first go down into the depths before the Lord's hand could raise one up.
This necessary descent, according to his teaching, required the explicit rejection of all established religions and social conventions, the commission of strange acts, and a voluntary abasement, which the book links to a path of libertinism and utter shamelessness. This was presented as a radical form of tikkun, or rectification of the soul.
A very unconventional fixing. And key to navigating this dangerous path was the necessity of perfect silence, even deceit.
Why silence?
This was deemed crucial to overcome what Frank referred to as opposing powers, which the book interprets as the gods or forces of other religions and belief systems. You couldn't let them know what you were really doing.
The source presents this as the mystic principle of the burden of silence, a new, radical version of the Sabbatean injunction against appearing outwardly as one truly was inwardly. Frank is quoted comparing this necessity for silence and concealment to conquering a fortress without speaking or an archer holding their breath as they aim.
Stealth mode. The book also highlights an astonishing and clear-cut ideology of Jewish territorialism that was reportedly present among the Frankists.
Territorialism, like wanting land.
Yes, it discusses the perspective of a Frankist writer from Prague who believed Israel's historical exile wasn't a punishment for sin, as traditionally understood, but rather a deliberate cosmic plan to destroy the Caliphate globally.
So exile was part of the plan to fight evil everywhere.
That's the idea presented. And according to this writer's view, simply returning thousands of Jews to the land of Israel would not be sufficient to complete this global task. This doctrine was allegedly a deep, secret mystical principle hidden within Kabbalah until it was revealed by Frank in Poland.
Okay, so a hidden agenda within a hidden agenda. Now, this is where the book makes a pivotal connection, linking Frank and his movement to major financial and organizational powers. Rabbi Marvin S. Antelman's work is cited to explain Frank's alleged financing in Frankfurt.
Frankfurt is specifically noted in the source as being the headquarters at the time of both Jesuit Adam Weishaupt, who would go on to found the Illuminati, and the burgeoning financial empire of the Rothschild brothers.
A convergence of figures.
Antelman's claim, as presented, is that a significant alliance was formed in Frankfurt before Frank even arrived there. Weishaupt provided the network and resources of the Jesuit order, known for its organizational and potentially conspiratorial capabilities, while the Rothschilds contributed the essential financial power.
Okay, Jesuit organization plus Rothschild money. What was missing?
And what this powerful combination was reportedly missing, according to the source's interpretation of Antelman, was a means to effectively spread their agenda widely and deeply throughout society. The Frankists, with their existing network of followers who were already adept at concealment and operating in secret, allegedly provided this missing element, spreading their influence throughout both the Christian and Islamic worlds. They were the foot soldiers, perhaps.
And notably, the source claims, based on Antelman, that Jacob Frank became instantly wealthy upon his arrival in Frankfurt because he received a nice handout directly from Mayor Amschel Rothschild.
Instant funding. So the book weaves together the threads of Sabbatean heresy, Frankist radicalism and networks, Jesuit organization, and Rothschild finance.
Which brings us directly to the formation of the Illuminati, the role of the Rothschilds, and the alleged power of secret societies, as the source text presents it.
Exactly.
The book pins the formal founding date of the Orden der Perfektiblesen, or the Illuminati of Bavaria, by Adam Weishaupt, to May 1st, 1776. The source notes Weishaupt's complex background. He is described as the son of a Jewish Kabbalist rabbi, educated and converted by Jesuits, who became a priest but later defected from the order. Quite a resume.
And reiterates the claim that Weishaupt formed a crucial alliance with Lord Mayer Rothschild, who allegedly financed the Illuminati's ambitious agenda.
The book specifically discusses the significance the author attributes to the founding date itself. It claims Weishaupt deliberately arranged the timing using Kabbalistic numerology.
The numbers again.
Calculating May 1st as 5 plus 1 Calix, 1776 as 1 plus 7 plus 7 plus 6, 21, and then combining these to get 6 plus 21, 27, which is 3 by 9. This is presented as having occult Kabbalistic power, and the belief was that timing these actions correctly was absolutely crucial for their ultimate success.
Getting the stars aligned, so to speak. The book then lays out what it presents as the 6 long-term political goals of the Illuminati. These goals are described as foundational to their alleged long-term plan for reshaping global society.
Let's list them as the source presents them. First, the abolition of all monarchies and ordered governments.
Second, the abolition of private property and inheritances.
Third, the abolition of patriotism and nationalism, aiming to dissolve loyalty to individual nations.
Fourth, the abolition of family life and marriage.
Fifth, the establishment of communal education for children, separating them from parental influence.
And sixth, the ultimate abolition of all religion. Pretty comprehensive.
Very comprehensive, very radical. The book connects these goals explicitly back to Frankism and also links them to Zionism. Barry Chamish is quoted, claiming that the Rothschilds' goal of controlling global wealth combined with the Frankist vision of destroying traditional Jewish ethics and replacing religion with doctrines based on the opposite of God's intentions.
And the result.
The source states this blend resulted in what it calls a bloody war against humanity.
Rabbi Marvin Antelman's view is again presented here. He claims that Rothschild specifically convinced Weishaupt to accept and integrate key aspects of Frankist doctrine into the Illuminati structure and goals. According to Antelman, as cited, Rothschild financed the Illuminati specifically to fulfill a dual agenda. The Frankist plot to subvert and ultimately destroy existing religions, and a specific Zionist objective, which the book describes as the establishment of a global government ruled by a king from Jerusalem.
Okay, so multiple interlocking goals. A crucial strategy the source outlines for the Illuminati was the infiltration of existing power structures, particularly Freemasonry.
Right, working from within.
Beginning, according to the book, in 1777, they allegedly began cooperating with Masonic lodges with a specific focus on the Grand Orient lodges with the intention of secretly infiltrating and ultimately controlling them from within.
The source cites historical figures like the Duke of Brunswick and British historian Nesta Webster as evidence of the Illuminati's purported success in gaining control over various lodges. It also claims that Rothschild provided significant financial backing specifically for the Grand Orient Lodge network at the time Weishaupt joined, facilitating this infiltration. Follow the money.
The book includes details on Weishaupt's alleged teaching regarding the deception of lower-degree Freemasons. The instruction was not to reveal the full radical system to members until they reached the highest degrees.
Need-to-know basis.
Lower, unsuitable members were to be kept in the lodges without ever gaining deeper knowledge of the true, hidden agenda.
Professors Kosandi and Renner are cited from their 1785 testimony during an investigation, stating clearly, all Illuminati are Freemasons, but far from all Freemasons are Illuminati, suggesting the Illuminati operated as a secret core within the broader Masonic structure.
Like a parasite within a host, almost. The name Illuminati itself is interpreted by the source as implying that members possess the light of Lucifer, viewing themselves as uniquely enlightened and therefore capable of governing the world.
Quite a claim to make.
Their openly declared purpose is presented as Novus Ordo Seclorum, or a New World Order, a one-world government, which the source claims they intended to be ruled from its capital in Jerusalem.
This is where the book includes the even more controversial quote attributed to Albert Pike, a highly influential figure in Freemasonry, claiming that the true name of Satan is actually Yahweh reversed.
Wow.
And that Lucifer, meaning light bearer or son of the morning, is the one who truly bears the light, suggesting a Luciferian philosophy at the highest levels.
The source then details a foundational event for the Rothschild financial empire's alleged role in this global agenda. Mayor Rothschild summoning 12 affluent men to Frankfurt and presenting them with a comprehensive 25-point plan aimed at gaining control of global wealth, resources, and manpower.
The master plan. Key points of this alleged plan, as mentioned across various sources cited in the book, included strategies such as preaching liberalism as a means to subtly usurp political power by undermining traditional authority.
Initiating and exacerbating class warfare within societies was another point. They allegedly planned to systematically dismantle existing institutions, governments, laws, social structures, and then reconstruct them under their control.
Crucially, the plan called for remaining completely invisible and operating from the shadows until they had amassed sufficient power and influence.
Stay hidden until it's too late for anyone to stop you.
Using mob psychology and manipulating public opinion was deemed essential.
A disturbing point listed is the systematic advocacy and use of alcoholic liquors, drugs, moral corruption, and vice, specifically targeted at corrupting youth and weakening societal fabric.
Social engineering through degradation. They plan to strategically use the press and media for propaganda, controlling public information to shape narratives while remaining hidden and avoiding blame for problems created.
How would they do that?
They would allegedly manipulate events to make the masses believe they were victims of random criminals or chaos, then step in to restore order, presenting themselves as saviors while solidifying their control. Order out of chaos.
Infiltrating Freemasonry, particularly the Grand Orient lodges, and cloaking their manipulative work under the guise of philanthropy and benevolent causes was a key tactical element. Look good while doing bad.
They intended to spread atheistic and materialistic ideology among the Goyim, a term the source uses meaning Gentiles or non-Jews,
Right.
through subtle deception, coded phrases, and catchy slogans, undermining traditional religious and moral beliefs.
The ultimate goal presented was the establishment of a world government achieved through the creation of corporate monopolies and the control of global finance, eventually consolidating control over even the large fortunes of the Goyim.
This would be enforced through all-out economic warfare, including high taxes and unfair competition designed to crush independent enterprise. They plan to control sufficient police forces and domestic soldiers to suppress any potential opposition.
And the endgame.
This entire structure would eventually be presented as the New World Order, under which a single dictator would ultimately be appointed to rule.
The source also includes Fritz Springmeier's claim that directly connects Marxism to Frankism, describing Marxism as a satanic cult that was used to control Jews and non-Jews alike.
It reiterates Frank's alleged teaching that the most effective way to hide and practice this form of Satanism was to outwardly convert to another religion.
The book even mentions in passing the controversial claim that Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theories allegedly have roots or influences stemming from Frankism.
Interesting tangent. Turning back to the Illuminati structure, Adam Weishaupt reportedly spent 5 years meticulously developing its system, which the source claims was deliberately based on the hierarchical structure of the Jesuit order.
How was it structured?
He divided the membership into 3 main classes: the novices lesser illuminated, the Freemasons, and the highest mystery class, which included the innermost circle of priests, regents, magicians, and ultimately the self-proclaimed king. The source draws a comparison to the levels within the Jesuit structure.
The vow required upon entering the Illuminati is detailed, highlighting the commitment demanded. Members swore never to use their position against a fellow brother, to consider the order's best interests as their own, and to serve the order with their fortune, honor, and even their blood.
Total loyalty.
The vow also stated that the friends and enemies of the order automatically became their own.
And the warning to ensure absolute secrecy was explicit and severe. Traitors were warned that they would be pursued relentlessly by the brothers, who would seek to expose them to public shame, contempt, and wrath.
Serious consequences.
The source notes that despite the radical goals at the top, few lower-level members were allegedly told the true, ultimate purpose of world domination, genuinely believing they were working towards global improvement and enlightenment. Plausible deniability built in.
However, according to the book, the secret network faced a significant challenge in the form of a police crackdown between 1785 and 1787 in Bavaria.
What happened?
The critical event was in 1785 when Jacob Lanz, a courier carrying secret documents for the Illuminati, was reportedly struck by lightning and killed. A literal bolt from the blue.
When police examined his body, they discovered papers and lists sewn into his robe that detailed the conspiracy, including explicit instructions for instigating the French Revolution. This discovery triggered further investigations.
Subsequently, more incriminating documents detailing the extent of the conspiracy were seized by police at the house of Dr. Franz Xaver Zwack in 1786 and later at Baron Bassus's castle in 1787.
The result of these discoveries was a ban on all secret societies in Bavaria and the issuance of an arrest order for Weishaupt. The source claims that while the Illuminatis were officially forced to disband and leave the Masonic lodges, they simply continued operating secretly as Freemasons, remaining hidden within those structures.
Just went deeper underground. Meanwhile, the Rothschild family was solidifying its power. The book notes that Meyer Rothschild moved his family in with the Schiff family in 1785, an alliance the source presents as significant.
And it details the guidelines laid out in Meyer Rothschild's will upon his death in 1812, which were reportedly strictly followed by his descendants for generations.
What kind of rules?
These rules included ensuring that only male family members could hold important positions in the business, and that only they could be involved in the family enterprise. The oldest son of the oldest son was typically designated as the head, unless the others unanimously agreed on an alternative. Nathan was appointed head in 1812.
Another key guideline was the instruction for family members to intermarry, marrying first or second cousins.
Why?
This was intended to keep the vast family fortune concentrated within the family and maintain a united financial empire, although the source notes this rule became less important later as the family's goals refocused and they began marrying into other wealthy, influential families, keeping it all in the family.
And perhaps most tellingly, the will stipulated that no public inventory of the estate should ever be conducted, no legal action taken against the estate, and no publication of the value of the inheritance. This ensured an extreme level of secrecy around their wealth and holdings.
Keep it quiet. The source also asserts a significant Jewish presence in the leadership ranks of the Illuminati, citing Bernard Lazar's 1894 book, which stated that Kabbalist Jews surrounded Weishaupt from the beginning.
The book claims that analysis of the confiscated Illuminati documents reveals that 17 out of 39 lesser leaders were Jewish, and that the percentage of Jewish members was even higher further up the ranks towards the core leadership.
Any specific names mentioned?
It names 4 specific individuals it describes as especially important Jewish members: Hartwig Wesley, Moses Mendelssohn, Daniel von Nitzig, and David Friedlander.
Okay. Let's shift gears and look at the symbolism the book discusses, which it claims provides hidden connections to these groups. It introduces the ubiquitous skull and crossbones symbol.
While acknowledging its historical use by pirates, the source links it directly to the Skull and Bones secret society at Yale University.
Right.
It delves into the speculation surrounding the meaning of the number 322 associated with Skull and Bones, suggesting a connection to a Greek fraternal society potentially dating back to Demosthenes in 322 BC, noting that Bones records are reportedly dated Anno Demostheni.
The book also includes a story from the controversial book The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which links the skull and crossbones symbol to the Knights Templar.
How so?
The story describes a Templar allegedly in love with the Lady of Maraclea. After her death, he purportedly dug up her body and found only a severed head resting on a pair of leg bones forming the symbol. A pretty gruesome origin story.
Sidon is noted as a historical nest of pirates and is linked to the Templars, commerce, and the slave trade.
This leads the source to discuss the Phoenicians, who originated near Sidon and were known as the sons of Canaan. It highlights their ancient seafaring travels far beyond the traditional limits of the Pillars of Hercules, their alleged links to the British Isles, and includes the controversial claim of pre-Columbian transatlantic trade, citing the disputed discovery of cocaine and tobacco traces in Egyptian mummies as potential evidence.
That's a big claim. The source even speculates that the historical flat Earth propaganda might have been deliberately spread by the Phoenicians to deter competitors and protect their lucrative long-distance trade monopoly.
Interesting theory.
While claiming the Templars likely knew the Earth was round, as Kabbalistic texts reportedly stated it.
It includes the intriguing story of the Paraiba stone inscription found in Brazil in 1872, etchings ascribed to Phoenicians and dated to the 19th year of King Hiram, around 500 BC. A translation is provided, though the source notes the debate between skeptical academic views and those of independent scholars who argue for its authenticity.
Phoenician presence in North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula, as well as the existence of a temple to Hercules at Gibraltar, are mentioned as supporting points for their widespread ancient influence.
And the book presents the fascinating idea that the two main pillars, Boaz and Jachin, in Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, which the source states were of Phoenician design, actually represented the Pillars of Hercules.
So hidden symbol in plain sight.
This is interpreted as a secret Phoenician symbol embedded at the very heart of Jerusalem, suggesting a hidden influence from the start.
Returning to Skull and Bones, the Yale tomb, their lodge building, is described its architecture, the secrecy surrounding its initiation rites, and the nature of its bi-weekly meetings.
The book recounts the well-known 1876 break-in by a rival group called the Order of File and Claw, who managed to get inside the tomb. Their descriptions of the lodge rooms are detailed: room 324 with black velvet hangings and room 322 with red velvet, featuring a pentagram, and pictures of founders and members purportedly linked to Germany.
Dr. Kathy Burns' interpretation of the skull and crossbones symbol is presented. She argues it is not derived from the Christian cross, but rather represents an X, symbolizing the slain and risen Egyptian god Osiris.
Like Hiram Abuth in Masonry.
Exactly. Often seen as a version of Hiram Abuth in modern occult practices.
The source connects the Templars' time in the Holy Land to their alleged acquaintance with various mystical traditions, including Kabbalah, Sufi sects, and other Jewish mystical groups.
And it links the skull and bones imagery, via Hermetic Kabbalah, to the Chi-Rho symbol, which is interpreted as representing time, death, and rebirth.
Chi-Rho, that's the Constantine symbol, right?
Yes. The Chi-Rho is further connected to the Egyptian god Horus, citing Egyptologist Sir Flinders Petrie, and its appearance on Constantine's coinage alongside a serpent, which the source ties to Gnosticism, alchemy, wisdom, and enlightenment.
An identical symbol to the Chi-Rho is noted as having been found in Sumer dating back to 2500 BC, interpreted there as various sun symbols, suggesting deep ancient roots for the symbolism.
The source claims that the Templars allegedly incorporated mysticism and what it terms perverse practices from groups like the Assassins during their time in the Holy Land. It suggests that their initial Christian faith gradually gave way to occult rituals and black magic, all hidden behind a public facade of religious piety.
Hiding in plain sight again. Author David Livingstone is introduced, known for tracing the genealogies of what he calls ancient occult bloodlines. The source mentions prominent families he includes in this category, such as the Rothschilds, Habsburgs, Sinclairs, Stuarts, Merovingians, Lusignans, and Windsors.
Livingstone's specific claim is included that the Illuminati were preceded by the Spanish Alumbrados, which he describes as a Christian heresy practiced by crypto-Jews and Marranos.
Okay.
He controversially argues that the founder of the Jesuit order, Ignatius of Loyola, was himself a Marrano and an Alumbrado, leading Livingston to argue that the Jesuits and Zionists are essentially the same beast operating under different names.
And finally, in this section, the source revisits Kabbalist Rabbi Isaac Luria, claiming he was a follower of Loyola, which is historically disputed.
Highly disputed, yeah.
And that Luria enunciated the principle of actively bringing about prophecy and redemption through the Messiah's arrival and the rule of the Illuminati.
How?
This was allegedly to be achieved by manipulating the course of fate through the use of magic and deliberately preparing the political and moral circumstances for a new world order.
Wow. So we followed the book's thread from the origins of the Sabbatean heresy through the radical evolution under Jacob Frank and his alleged alliances, to the formation and alleged hidden structure of the Illuminati and its connections to powerful families and symbolism.
A lot to take in.
Now let's look at how the source claims this network operationalizes its influence and pursues its agenda on a global scale, the alleged mechanisms of control.
The book delves into the realm of financial control as a primary mechanism. It includes the infamous letter, quote, attributed to Rothschild banker John Sherman in 1863, written to New York agents during the American Civil War. The quote is presented as a chilling insight into their alleged strategy regarding a proposed national bank.
The quote, as presented, suggests that the few people who understand the financial system will either be so focused on their own profits and favors or so dependent on the system that they will be beholden to it.
Right.
Meanwhile, the large majority of people who are incapable of comprehending how the system works will bear its burdens, such as debt and taxes, without ever suspecting that the system is specifically designed to operate against their interests and for the benefit of a hidden elite.
Edith Starr Miller's view from her book is mentioned, supporting the idea of a powerful Rothschild syndicate that included other prominent Jewish financiers of the era, such as Itzig, Friedlander, the Goldsmiths, and the Matatas, forming a cohesive financial bloc.
Miller's summary of the Illuminati's alleged goals is reiterated to emphasize the comprehensiveness of their agenda. This includes the planned destruction of Christianity, monarchies, and nation-states to pave the way for world government and what she terms internationalism.
It also lists the abolition of family ties and marriage through the active promotion of things like homosexuality and promiscuity, the end of inheritance and private property, and the suppression of all forms of collective identity, national, racial, religious, under the guise of promoting universal human brotherhood, or, as the source interprets it in this context, diversity.
Dr. Henry Mackow's perspective from his book Illuminati, The Cult That Hijacked the World, is heavily drawn upon in this section, presented as a straightforward summary of the modern situation.
His core claim, which the source presents as controversial but central to its narrative, is that the vast majority of ordinary Jewish people are entirely unaware of or are being manipulated by this alleged network.
That's a huge accusation.
Mackow claims the Illuminati operates as a cult that hides behind the facade of ordinary Jews, and that its true form is a tiny, powerful nucleus of Kabbalistic bankers and Masons, based primarily in London and ultimately directed by the Rothschilds.
Mackow's view, as presented, is that Judaism itself has been hijacked by this group. He contrasts what he describes as Moses' original vision of a universal moral force with the Babylonian Talmud, which he claims represents the interpretations of the Pharisees during the Babylonian exile.
And the Talmud takes precedence.
According to Mackow cited here, the Talmud has taken precedence over Moses' spirit and often contradicts it.
He makes the broad claim that the secret society model is the fundamental basis for various movements and groups, including certain interpretations of Judaism, Freemasonry, Zionism, and communism.
How does that model work, according to him?
In this model, the leadership allegedly deceives and manipulates the members with idealistic goals, and only the most corruptible or those susceptible to blackmail are allowed to rise to the highest levels and learn the true hidden agenda.
The book includes Macow's contention that this elite network of bankers controls the world's major corporations, dominates mainstream media outlets to control information, exerts influence over intelligence agencies, and funds influential think tanks, foundations, and even federally funded universities.
Controlling the narrative.
Which he claims are used, intentionally or not, to suppress inconvenient truths and alternative narratives.
It presents some of Macow's more controversial claims regarding social engineering. He alleges that the active promotion of feminism and favoritism towards non-white minorities is part of a deliberate agenda aimed at undermining the traditional European, heterosexual, and Christian character of Western society.
Mass immigration and the encouragement of interracial marriage, according to Weishaupt cited here, are claimed to be specifically designed to degrade and ultimately remove any potential for unified opposition rooted in ethnic or cultural identity.
So divide and conquer through social change.
He asserts that much of modern culture and politics is, at its core, propaganda and a form of social engineering orchestrated by this hidden network.
And the strong social condemnation for perceived sexism and racism is claimed by Weishaupt to be deliberately engineered to undermine traditional gender roles and racial identity, with manufactured guilt being presented as a huge psychological weapon used for control.
Weishaupt's view is that what appears as British, American, or Zionist imperialism is, in reality, the manifestation of this banker-driven agenda for world government, pursued through the systematic destruction of traditional religion, nationhood, race, and family structures globally.
He makes the controversial point that this form of alleged imperialism doesn't actually express the interests of ordinary people in these nations, who he claims are effectively being colonized themselves by the same hidden power.
Colonized from within.
He also includes the Rockefeller and Morgan empires as being integrated into this central banking cartel.
And the astonishing claim is made that at the highest level of this alleged global network, all major intelligence agencies, including MI6, the CIA, the Mossad, and the KGB or their equivalents, ultimately answer to the central banking cartel, not to their nominal national governments.
Wow. A shadow government controlling the spies. The source reiterates Weishaupt's claim that interpretations found in the Babylonian Talmud, and particularly heretical interpretations of Kabbalah, contribute significantly to historical and modern anti-Semitism by presenting doctrines that are viewed as exclusionary or hostile to non-adherents.
David Bay, from Cutting Edge Ministry, is cited expressing the sentiment that Kabbalah serves as the keystone of Western occult thought and practice, forming the cornerstone for the Illumined Ones, or Masters of the Illuminati, and that this esoteric practice is inherently hostile even to non-Kabbalistic Jews.
Elizabeth Dilling's quote is included, stating that any resentment or criticism directed towards such teachings is consistently portrayed and deflected by being labeled as persecution of the Jewish people as a whole.
The source reiterates the claim that the highest levels of the Illuminati, along with the Templars and certain Kabbalist bankers, while perhaps outwardly idealizing classical Greek philosophers, are privately practicing what it terms aberrated forms of Frankist Luciferianism, which the book equates directly with hardcore Satanism.
Albert Pike's purported admission, quote, that Freemasons at the highest level worship Lucifer, the light bearer, or Satan, is presented again as evidence for this alleged Luciferian core.
The book returns to the discussion of Kabbalistic symbolism, presenting interpretations related to achieving universal harmony through the sexual union of deities and the concept that arousal below provokes arousal above, meaning actions in the physical realm influence the spiritual.
And how does that connect?
This is claimed by the source to be the underlying basis for the alleged Illuminati sex cults. The basic solar symbol, a dot within a circle, is interpreted in this occult context as representing the union of the penis and vagina.
The source draws a direct line between the promotion of free sex and progressive ideas in modern society and the alleged historical practices of Sabbatean sex, which it claims engaged in ritualistic wife-sharing, drug use, sex orgies, adultery, and incest for over 350 years.
It makes the provocative claim that sexual abandon is a defining characteristic of communist philosophy, presenting communism as a direct outgrowth of Sabbatean Frankism.
Any examples given?
It offers historical examples it deems supportive, such as Jacob Frank allegedly pimping his beautiful wife to recruit followers, claims of the Communist Party using female members in a similar fashion for political purposes, and Adam Weishaupt reportedly getting his own sister-in-law pregnant.
The source asserts that these illuminated secret societies perform these religious ritualistic sex rites as a core part of their hidden worship, linking these practices back to the Socratic concept of communism in ancient Greece, which allegedly involved holding wives and children in common for sexual purposes.
The book claims Socrates was convicted and ultimately executed for corrupting the youth, primarily because of his advocacy for this practice.
That's a very specific interpretation.
Highly controversial historical interpretation.
Yeah.
It then links the modern popularization of sex magic and occult sex rituals to figures like Aleister Crowley and his unique spelling of sex magic with a K to differentiate it.
It reiterates the claim that Illuminati bankers were the creators and orchestrators of communism, seeing it as a tool to harness the power of the working class for the ultimate purpose of establishing a comprehensive world dictatorship, which the book equates with modern globalization.
And it notes that both the Illuminati and communism are presented as Masonic secret societies that share May 1st as a significant anniversary and utilize satanic symbols, suggesting a shared hidden origin and purpose.
The source introduces the philosophical framework of the Hegelian dialectic as a fundamental tool used by this network for control. George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's dialectic method, thesis antithesis, is explained as a way the mind understands reality through perceived polar opposites, good versus evil, right versus wrong, left versus right in politics.
The source applies this to politics, illustrating how seemingly opposing political parties, like Labor and Liberal, function as thesis and antithesis.
How does that work?
Their public debates focus only on minor, predetermined differences, carefully avoiding discussion of fundamental issues that neither party, both allegedly controlled by the same network, wants addressed. Controlled opposition.
It then presents the problem, reaction, then solution form of the dialectic as a specific method of manipulation used on a grand scale for major world events.
The classic formula.
The explanation is that the network creates or utilizes a crisis, presenting it as the problem. This manufactured or exploited crisis triggers a widespread reaction from the public, who are engineered to demand a solution, usually through fear and outrage.
Amen.
The network then offers its solution, which is not a genuine resolution to the problem, but a predetermined outcome that serves its own agenda, often involving a further erosion of freedoms or consolidation of power.
The source includes Dennis Healy's quote, then a British Labour politician, later Lord Healy, stating, "World events do not occur by accident. Most of them are staged and managed by those who hold the purse string," presented as an explicit acknowledgement of this orchestrated reality.
So, having explored the alleged structure, methods, and philosophy of these groups, the book moves to detailing how it claims they have specifically manipulated historical nations and conflicts to advance their agenda on the world stage.
Exactly. Getting into the actual historical events, according to this book.
Let's dive into that historical stage. The book presents a controversial claim regarding British Freemasonry and the creation of the State of Israel. Barry Chalmers is quoted, stating flatly that there would be no modern state of Israel without the involvement and planning of British Freemasonry.
He discusses the alleged British Israelite movement, initiated within Freemasonry in the 1860s, with the explicit goal of establishing a Jewish Masonic state in Palestine.
And Rothschilds were involved?
While figures like Rothschild and Montefiore reportedly financed infrastructure projects there, the source claims it was difficult to convince mainstream European Jews to immigrate to Palestine in large numbers.
The alarming solution presented by the source to this recruitment problem was that Europe was to be turned into a nightmare for the Jews to create the necessary impetus for emigration to Palestine.
That's incredibly dark, if true.
To support the idea of Rothschild involvement in instigating conflict for gain, the source includes a quote from the Labor Leader newspaper in 1891, which referred to the Rothschilds as a blood-sucking crew who amassed their wealth and caused mischief and misery throughout Europe by deliberately fomenting wars and ensuring they were financially positioned near places of disturbance.
The source also claims the Rothschilds systematically gained control of key information channels, stating they purchased Reuters news agency by the end of the 1800s and controlled major European news agencies like Wolf, Reuters, and Havas.
Control the news, control the narrative. And it discusses Jacob Schiff, presented as a Rothschild associate, setting up the Anti-Defamation League and ADL in the U.S. in 1913.
What was the purpose, according to this?
Which the source claims was intended to slander anyone who criticized or exposed the alleged Rothschild conspiracy as being anti-Semitic. The book asserts that mainstream media rarely reports on the Rothschilds because they allegedly own or control key parts of it.
The passage of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913 in the United States is highlighted, noting the controversial late-night vote on December 22, 1913, just before Christmas break, when many congressmen had already left.
Sneaking it through. The book includes the later quote from President Woodrow Wilson, who signed the act into law but later expressed deep regret.
Saying what?
Stating that the nation's credit and all its economic activities were in the hands of a few men, and that the government was controlled and dominated by small groups of dominant men, who he claimed were manipulating the system. Buyer's remorse, perhaps?
World War I and the events leading to the Balfour Declaration are then presented through this controversial lens. The book mentions Chaim Weizmann, then president of the British Zionist Federation, working with UK Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour towards the declaration in 1917.
The central explosive claim made by the source regarding this event is that Britain agreed to issue the Balfour Declaration, promising to give Palestine to the Rothschild Zionists, specifically in exchange for bringing America into the war against Germany.
A quid pro quo involving Palestine and U.S. entry into WWI.
That's the claim. The actual text of the Balfour Declaration is included, and the book states its subsequent publication and later incorporation into the peace treaty following WW1 and the Mandate for Palestine, solidifying the promise.
It reiterates the source's assertion that the United States entered World War I directly because of this alleged deal orchestrated by the Zionists and the British, and that this intervention led to Germany's ultimate defeat.
The Versailles Peace Conference in 1919 is discussed, where the terms of German reparations were decided. The force notes that a significant delegation of 117 Zionists, headed by Bernard Baruch, was present and prominently brought up the issue of Palestine.
The book presents a striking perspective on the reaction of the defeated Germans at Versailles. It claims they allegedly realized for the first time why America had suddenly turned against them when they saw the Balfour Declaration and understood, according to the source's wording, that was the game.
The German perspective presented from the source was one of profound betrayal and resentment. They allegedly realized they had been defeated and were suffering under crippling reparations because the Zionists wanted control of Palestine at any cost, and the manipulation of America's entry into the war was the price paid.
The source points out that according to its narrative, Germany was considered the friendliest country to Jews in Europe prior to WW1, having issued an emancipation edict in 1822 and providing refuge to Jews fleeing Russia after the failed communist coup attempt there in 1905. This historical context is used to heighten the sense of alleged betrayal felt by the Germans.
This leads the source to heavily feature the testimony of Benjamin H. Friedman, a Jewish businessman who claimed to have spent a significant fortune later in his life trying to expose what he saw as a vast conspiracy. He claimed personal acquaintance with many of the key figures involved, including Baruch, Untermeyer, Wilson, the Roosevelts, and the Kennedys.
An insider's perspective, supposedly.
Rah.
The book includes extensive excerpts from Friedman's 1961 speech presented as crucial evidence. In these excerpts, Friedman claimed that Germany had effectively won World War I by the summer of 1916.
How?
He stated that their submarine warfare had brought Britain to the brink of starvation, they were low on supplies and food, the French army had mutinied, Russia had defected from the war effort, the Italian army had collapsed, and crucially, there was no fighting happening on German soil.
According to Friedman quoted here, Germany offered England a negotiated peace based on the status quo ante, essentially ending the war with no territorial changes. He claimed England was seriously considering this offer because of their desperate situation.
But then he claimed, the Zionists in Germany, aware of Britain's predicament, went to the British War Cabinet and made a counterproposal. You can yet win this war if the United States will come in as your ally.
Friedman stated the Zionists allegedly promised to use their influence to bring the U.S. into the war if Britain, in return, promised them Palestine after Germany was defeated. He calls Britain's right to promise land they didn't own absurd.
He claimed this secret deal was made in October 1916. Shortly after this agreement, according to Friedman, the situation in the United States, which had previously been almost entirely pro-German.
Why pro-German?
As its newspapers, bankers, and media were largely controlled by Jews who had emigrated from Germany and wanted to see Germany defeat the Russian Tsar, underwent a sudden and dramatic shift in attitude and media coverage.
He described this change as being like the traffic light turning. Suddenly, the Germans were portrayed as brutal villains, Huns, and fabricated atrocities were widely publicized, such as claims of German soldiers shooting Red Cross nurses and cutting off babies' hands. Propaganda overdrive.
President Woodrow Wilson then declared war on Germany shortly after this shift in public opinion and media narrative. Friedman claimed the United States was deliberately railroaded and suckered into the war, merely so that the Zionists of the world could obtain Palestine, and that the American public was never told the real reason for their entry into the war.
The Balfour Declaration, according to Friedman, was simply Britain's written confirmation of this promise, the payment to the Zionists for successfully getting the U.S. to abandon neutrality and join the war effort. The U.S. intervention then decisively crushed Germany.
At the Paris Peace Conference, Friedman claimed the Jewish delegation headed by Bernard Baruch formally asked for Palestine and allegedly for the first time to the awareness of the German delegation, produced the Balfour Declaration as their claim.
This is when, according to the account, the Germans supposedly realized the full scope of the manipulation. Oh, that was the game. That's why the United States came into the war. They allegedly understood then and there that they were defeated and suffering under the immense reparations and territorial losses, because the Zionists wanted Palestine at any cost, and had orchestrated America's entry into the war to achieve it.
Friedman claimed the German subsequent resentment towards Jews was therefore not religious in origin, but purely political. The Germans, from this perspective, held Jews responsible for their crushing defeat and the harsh terms of the peace treaty. He controversially claimed that initially, not a hair on the head of any Jew was harmed in Germany following this realization.
And he alleged that Jewish leaders subsequently tried to keep this historical narrative quiet, not wanting the world to understand they had sold out Germany for their own political objectives regarding Palestine.
The source concludes from this account that this alleged manipulation and betrayal regarding WWI is the great betrayal that Adolf Hitler reportedly referenced, and that it attracted Germans to him not primarily because they were inherently racist, but because they felt this covert Masonic conspiracy had destroyed their nation.
Wow. The book even mentions the claim, presented as evidence against common narratives, that Hitler's personal driver and cook were allegedly Jewish.
The French film Forces Occults, Occult Forces, made in 1943 during the German occupation by an ex-Freemason named Jean Mimi, is discussed.
The film reportedly depicts a young politician being initiated into Freemasonry and gradually learning of its alleged hidden nefarious purposes. The Institute for Historical Review, IHR, is cited describing it as the most important anti-Masonic feature film ever made, claiming it reflected a broad sentiment within occupied France.
And the consequences.
The book notes the severe repercussions for those involved after the liberation of France, with the director, producer, and writer all punished, and Mammy himself sentenced to death and executed.
The source then returns to discuss Hitler and the German economy, specifically challenging the narrative presented by Rothschild-controlled mainstream media, which it characterizes as depicting Hitler as uniquely evil, responsible for needless wars and mass slaughter.
It presents an alternative view, which it claims is based on unbiased history and interviews, asserting that the commonly told story is extremely inaccurate and a deliberate distortion.
It describes the dire state of Germany when Hitler came to power. A nation with massive unemployment, no money, and a starving populace crippled by the reparations demanded after WWI. It details the hyperinflation crisis where a wheelbarrow full of 100 billion mark notes couldn't even buy a loaf of bread.
Incredible image.
And homes and farms were being seized by banks allegedly controlled by the Rothschild and Rockefeller families.
Dr. Hjalmar Horace Greeley-Schacht, who served as Hitler's Reichsbank president, is quoted from his book The Magic of Money, stating that the catastrophic devaluation of the German mark began after the Reichsbank was privatized, suggesting the government lost control of its currency.
The source concludes from this that the German government was not actually responsible for the hyperinflation, but rather the privately owned central bank and its monopoly over currency issuance, blaming the bankers, not the state.
It claims Hitler's decisive action was to directly refuse the rules and control of the Rothschild and Rockefeller international bankers. Instead, Germany issued its own debt-free Reichsmarks, currency that was uncontrollable by international finance, effectively thwarting the banking cartel's power over the nation's economy.
The presented result was that Germany printed its own national currency based on its own economic output, instead of being forced to borrow money on interest from a privately owned Rothschild bank, a situation the source compares directly to the current structure of the U.S. Federal Reserve.
This policy, according to the source, allegedly lifted Germany entirely from the Depression within a few years, ushering in a decade of what it calls self-determined growth and prosperity. It details the debt-free financing of massive infrastructure projects across the country: roads, bridges, dams, canals, ports, and widespread repair of buildings, all funded by public money that owed no interest to international banksters.
The source includes a quote attributed to Hitler. For every mark issued, we required the equivalent of a mark's worth of work done or goods produced. It claims unemployment was solved in just 2 years and Germany was back on its feet.
The book seeks to debunk the common narrative that Germany's economic recovery was solely based on rearmament for war, citing British historian A.J.P. Taylor. Taylor is quoted stating that Germany's recovery by 1936 rested significantly on lavish expenditure on public works, particularly the Autobahnen,
Highways, right.
which stimulated private spending, aligning with Keynesian economic principles.
And Taylor is also quoted as allegedly noting that while other European nations were preparing for war in the late 1930s, Hitler was the one man who neither expected nor planned for it, a controversial claim presented as evidence against the idea that Hitler's economic policies were solely driven by militaristic preparation.
The source draws a parallel to the modern situation, presenting the idea that if America were to nationalize its currency, similar to what it claims Hitler did, it could sever ties with international bankers and alleged manipulation and operate debt-free.
This idea is connected to the fate of several U.S. presidents: Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Jackson, and John F. Kennedy, all of whom the source claims issued interest-free national currency and were allegedly murdered or attacked by the same banking interests for doing so.
The source also presents observations on social conditions within Nazi Germany based on accounts it cites. R. Grunberger's claim from his 1976 book, The 12-Year Reich, is included, stating that there were significant drops in rates of murder, robbery, theft, embezzlement, and petty larceny during the years of Hitler's rule.
Sir Arnold Wilson, a British member of Parliament, is cited for his observations after visiting Germany during this period. He reportedly expressed being impressed by the improvement in people's outlook and health, the reduced infant mortality and disease rates, the low crime and prison population, and the apparent physical fitness of the youth.
He noted the poor were better clothed, and people seemed to have cheerful faces, suggesting a psychological improvement in national morale.
The philosophy behind the Nazi state, as mentioned here, was presented as ensuring all citizens shared a similar standard of living. The large public welfare program, symbolized by the slogan, "None shall starve nor freeze," and the participation of even high-ranking Nazis and wealthy citizens in collecting charity are noted as practices that allegedly generated a sense of comradeship within the population.
The source then returns to the controversial term Holocaust, stating its first public mention in relation to a potential future event concerning Jews was purportedly in 1936 by Chaim Weizmann at the World Zionist Congress.
Weizmann is quoted as allegedly saying, "Perhaps only 2 million Jews will survive the upcoming Holocaust, but they will be strong and good for the land of Israel. The rest will be blown into the dust pile of history."
A chilling quote, if accurate. The book then presents the term's technical meaning, according to Rabbi Marvin Antelman, as a burnt offering, a sacrifice. Bruno Bettelheim's quote, calling the use of this term for mass murder a sacrilege, is included.
The source then pointedly poses the questions: whose sacrifice was it? For what purpose? And links it directly back to the Sabbatean Frankist occult political agenda discussed earlier, suggesting the tragic events were somehow tied to this hidden plan.
Henry Mahou's view is included, stating that every time the word Holocaust is used, people are unwittingly joining in their sacrilege, reinforcing the idea that the term itself is part of the alleged occult agenda.
This section goes into a deeply sensitive and controversial area by discussing alleged connections between labor Zionism and the Nazis. It starts with Barry Chamish posing a sensitive question and providing what he calls a hardly ever discussed answer,
Which is
highlighting the dramatic shift from over 250 different German Jewish organizations existing in 1932 to only one, labor Zionism, being permitted or operational in 1933.
The narrative presented is that Rothschild money and Jesuit organizational power initiated the Enlightenment period with the long-term aim of creating a Sabbatean Frankist state in the land of Israel. To achieve this, life had to become intolerable for European Jews, making emigration to Palestine seem like the most desirable or only option.
The source explicitly asks the listener to consider if this is merely a conspiracy theory or if it is supported by documented fact, framing the subsequent points as evidence from the book.
Right.
Theodor Herzl, considered the father of modern Zionism, is presented as someone who claimed the establishment of a Jewish state would cure anti-Semitism, but is also portrayed as actively promoting and intending to harness anti-Semitism to further his cause.
Herzl's diary is quoted where he allegedly wrote that it was an excellent idea to call in respectable, accredited anti-Semites as liquidators of property. The anti-Semites will become our most dependable friends. The anti-Semitic countries are allies. Using your enemies, essentially.
Israeli historian Benny Morris is cited describing Herzl as someone who foresaw and calculated the potential for harnessing anti-Semitism, seeing Zionism's triumph as inevitable, both because life would become untenable for Jews in Europe and because European nations would be interested in getting rid of them.
Christopher John Brickness' quote is included, stating that since Jewish support for a Rothschild world government ruled by a king from Jerusalem was lacking, the only way to force Jews to emigrate to Palestine was to put Hitler and Stalin in power and persecute Jews on a massive and unprecedented scale.
That's an extreme claim. Gary Chamish's claims are presented. In 1933, less than 1% of German Jews supported Zionism. Attempts by non-Zionist Jews to escape Germany were allegedly turned back by an international diplomatic order, creating a situation where rejecting the option of Palestine meant facing death.
So, a forced choice.
By 1934, according to Chamish, the majority of German Jews got the message and turned to the labor Zionists, who were allegedly the only Jewish group the Nazis allowed to operate freely.
The source claims that confirmation of a conspiracy between them and Hitler's regime can be found in several cited books, including The Transfer Agreement, Perfidy, and The Scared and the Doomed.
The alleged deal described by Chamish involved German Jews being indoctrinated into Bolshevism in labor Zionism camps that were permitted by the Nazis, and then transferred to Palestine with the approval of the British Mandate authorities.
The book points to the 1935 Nuremberg laws, stating that only two flags were permitted to be flown in Nazi Germany, the swastika and the blue and white Zionist banner.
Lenny Brenner's book is cited, claiming that the Zionist Party was the only other political party besides the Nazis allowed freedom to operate in Nazi Germany, having a shared interest and formal partnership with the Nazis in the goal of making Jews emigrate to Palestine.
The source makes the controversial claim that pro-eugenics labor Zionists allegedly used the situation to ensure that primarily the Jews, they wanted those trained in farming in what it terms Nazi camps, were transferred to Palestine.
And the others.
Meanwhile, it alleges they deliberately allowed millions of Orthodox Jews, who were largely against political Zionism and non-Frankists, to perish, with their wealth being liquidated and transferred to the labor Zionists, referencing the transfer agreement.
A further claim is made that while non-Zionist Jews were facing extreme danger, Zionist leaders in America allegedly deliberately provoked and enraged Hitler by initiating a worldwide boycott of Nazi goods in 1933, an action presented as intentionally escalating tensions.
Chaim Weizmann is quoted again, stating callously, "Every nation has its dead in its fight for its homeland. The suffering under Hitler are our dead," a quote presented as evidence of a transactional view of Jewish lives in Europe as sacrifices for the Zionist cause.
Finally, Rabbi Moshe Schonfeld's accusation from his 1977 book, Holocaust Victims Accuse, is included. Schonfeld, an Orthodox rabbi, is quoted as accusing the Rothschild Zionists of collaborating in the Nazi slaughter and calling them war criminals for usurping leadership roles within the Jewish community, betraying fellow Jews, and then reaping moral and political capital from their treachery.
Schonfeld's powerful concluding statement is presented. The Zionist approach that Jewish blood is the anointing oil needed for the wheels of the Jewish state is not a thing of the past. It remains operable to this very day.
This extraordinarily complex and challenging historical narrative, as constructed and presented within this single-source text, is then claimed to continue into the post-war era, asserting that this network remains ongoing and influential today.
The source quotes Georgetown University professor Carol Quigley, who is reportedly Bill Clinton's mentor. Quigley is stated as saying, "The central banker plan is nothing less than to establish a world system, to dominate the political system of each country." This quote is presented as confirmation from an insider-connected academic.
The source claims that by the end of the 1800s, the Rothschilds had already secured control over major European news agencies like Wolf, Reuters, and Havas. Furthermore, it asserts that by 1940, other prominent publications like the New York Herald Tribune, the New York Times, and others were allegedly owned and controlled by central bankers and their frontmen, citing Dr. Henry Bekow and other sources within the book. This is presented as evidence of long-standing control over information flow.
James Back's claims from his book Crimes and Mercies regarding alleged post-war atrocities are discussed, challenging the conventional narrative of the Allied occupation.
His confrontation with New York Times reporter Drew Middleton is detailed. Back claimed Middleton had lied in 1945 by denying reports that the U.S. was deliberately starving over 1 million German POWs.
And Middleton's reaction.
When confronted later, Middleton allegedly stated he didn't care if his lie was exposed, and the source claims the New York Times witnessed and actively denied this policy.
Bach's estimate is included. An additional 8 to 12 million Germans were allegedly deliberately starved to death during the Allied occupation period between 1946 and 1950, after the fighting had stopped.
The shocking claim is made that for Germany, the war didn't truly end in 1945, and that the nation suffered physical and psychic trauma unparalleled in history during the post-war occupation.
The horrific scale of Red Army rapes is mentioned up to 2 million German women, including 100,000 in Berlin, as well as Russian women who had been in German camps. The source includes a pointed question. We live in a feminist era. Have you seen any movies about these women? Implying a deliberate suppression of this history by modern media and power structures.
Clifford Chapman's statement from his work, The Rothschilds, Winston Churchill, and the Final Solution is included, asserting that through calculated infiltration, stealth, and cunning, this invisible network has come to rule us all.
It reiterates the network's long history, claiming they infiltrated Masonry as early as 1717, effectively establishing it as a vehicle, and that Frank had a significant impact on the Illuminati's formation in 1776.
Freemasonry is explicitly claimed to be the hidden force behind major historical events like the American, French, and Russian revolutions, the creation of international bodies like the United Nations and the State of Israel, and even behind both world wars, including the events of the Holocaust.
And the Kennedys.
It controversially claims this network was also behind the assassinations of the Kennedy brothers, who allegedly attempted to thwart its power.
The Sabbatean and Frankists are described as the enduring cult of the all-seeing eye, a symbol the source links to the U.S. dollar bill. They are characterized as political and religious chameleons, capable of operating effectively everywhere there is power, and are presented as being both the good guys and the bad guys simultaneously, using the complex alliances and events of the WW2 era as a prime example of their alleged duality and manipulative strategy.
David Livingston's claim from his book, Terrorism and the Illuminati, a 3,000-year history, is reiterated, positing that all occult movements in history ultimately originate in the Kabbalah, which he dates back to the 6th century BC Babylonian exile.
He maintains his view that most of the alleged Illuminati bloodlines in European royalty are, in fact, descended from heretical or crypto-Jewish lineages.
Livingston's detailed explanation is summarized. He alleges that Kabbalist bankers, through their control of key financial institutions like the Bank of England and leverage over nations like Saudi Arabia and via British and American imperialism, deliberately conspired to break up the Ottoman Empire and intentionally keep the Middle East backward and unstable for their own strategic purposes.
And this shadow world government, according to Livingston, is claimed to actively use and manipulate various cults and religious extremist groups, such as Wahhabism and Salafi movements, as well as seemingly benevolent Masonic societies like the Muslim Brotherhood.
To what end?
Specifically to divide and destabilize the Islamic world, creating fanatical fundamentalism and terror. This is all presented as preparation for a coming, deliberately instigated war of civilizations.
So there you have it. We've taken a truly extensive deep dive into Robert Saper's 1666 Redemption Through Sin, Global Conspiracy and History.
It is certainly a complex, detailed, and interconnected historical narrative presented within this single source text, tracing a line from figures like Sabbatai Zevi and Jacob Frank through the alleged organizational power of Adam Weishaupt and the Rothschilds.
Yeah?
Exploring radical concepts like redemption through sin and the descent necessary before ascent, and linking them to secret organizations like the Sabbateans, Frankists, Illuminati, Freemasonry, specific factions within Zionism, and powerful bankers.
And it connects these groups and ideas to major world events like World War I, World War II, claiming they were orchestrated through economic manipulation, political infiltration, and social engineering, all described as part of a centuries-long plan aimed at global control and the establishment of a new world order.
This deep dive was a thorough, focused exploration of the specific claims, interpretations, and connections made entirely within this particular book that you provided. Our purpose, as your guides, was simply to understand its narrative, trace its threads, and highlight the many points it raises, making it clear these are the author's claims. We're not endorsing, just reporting from the source.
We hope this journey through this specific and challenging body of work has been insightful for you, the listener, in understanding the specific narrative it presents.
Given the complex web of hidden forces, secret knowledge, and alleged manipulation of history described in this book, it certainly leaves you pondering. If the true story of the world is one of such deeply concealed agendas and paradoxical paths to power, how do we even begin to look beneath the surface of perceived reality to understand the forces that truly shape the world around us?